At sunrise, in a forgotten corner of a suburban street, a trembling dog was tied to a metal signpost, abandoned and confused. Cars passed by, children on their way to school turned their eyes away. But when a yellow bus stopped, the driver, Helen, heard his faint whimpers. Something inside her, maybe a memory, maybe a mother's instinct, made her step out. That morning, she broke every rule and every schedule, choosing compassion over protocol. What began as a rescue became a quiet redemption for them both, as Helen discovered that sometimes saving a life also saves a heart that had stopped believing in kindness. The sun had barely begun to crack the horizon when Helen turned the key in the ignition of Bus 47. The yellow beast rumbled to life, its engine coughing in the cold October air, exhaling plumes of white vapor that dissolved into the dawn. She had been driving this route for 17 years. The same streets, the same stops, the same sleepy faces climbing aboard with backpacks too heavy for their small frames. 17 years of routine had carved deep grooves into her life, grooves so familiar she could navigate them half asleep, which sometimes she nearly did. Helen was 53 years old, though she felt older most days. Her hands, weathered and strong, gripped the oversized steering wheel with the confidence of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Her hair, once a rich chestnut brown, had faded to a steel grey. She kept pulled back in a practical bun. There was a time when she cared about such things, appearance, youth, the way people saw her. But that time had passed, buried somewhere beneath years of loss and disappointment that she rarely allowed herself to remember. The route began in the industrial edge of Millbrook, a mid-sized town in upstate New York, where old factories stood like tombstones to a more prosperous era. She would wind through neighborhoods that transitioned from worn down to working class to almost comfortable, collecting children at 17 designated stops before depositing them at Riverside Elementary by 8:15. The schedule was sacred. The district supervisor had made that abundantly clear during her last performance review. Helen pulled out of the depot as the streetlights began to flicker off, their overnight duty complete. The roads were still mostly empty, save for the occasional early shift worker heading to the diner or the plastics plant on Route 9. She liked these quiet moments before the pickups began, when the bus was still empty and the day's weight hadn't yet settled on her shoulders. She sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos, the radio playing low, some talk show host discussing politics she had stopped caring about years ago. The first stop was on Maple Avenue, where little Corey Jenkins waited with his grandmother every morning at 6:42. Helen could set her watch by them. But as she rounded the corner onto Bridgewater Street, a shortcut she'd been taking for the past 3 years, to shave off 2 minutes, something caught her attention. At first, it was just a shape, dark and low against the metal signpost that marked the intersection. She almost drove past, almost. But then she heard it, even over the rumble of the diesel engine, even through the thick glass of the driver's window. She heard it, a sound so faint and broken it could have been mistaken for the wind. But Helen knew better. It was a whimper, soft, desperate, barely there. The kind of sound that spoke of suffering, too exhausted to scream. She slowed the bus, her foot easing off the accelerator as her eyes locked onto the shape. As she drew closer, the early morning light revealed what her mind had already begun to suspect. It was a dog, small, matted, trembling violently in the cold. And he was tied to the signpost with what looked like a length of old extension cord, the orange rubber biting into the fur around his neck. Helen's breath caught. For a moment she sat frozen behind the wheel, the bus idling in the middle of the empty street. Her first instinct was practical, honed by years of following rules and staying on schedule. She was already running 3 minutes behind. Corey and his grandmother would be waiting. Then Marcus on Sullivan Drive, then the Peterson twins. 17 stops, 64 children, 8:15 arrival. The machine of her morning had no room for deviation. But the whimper came again, and this time it cracked something inside her chest. She thought of her own dog, Max, who had died 4 years ago. A golden retriever with eyes the color of honey and a heart that had loved her unconditionally through the darkest period of her life. When her husband, David, had left, just walked out one Tuesday afternoon with a suitcase and an apology that meant nothing, Max had been there. When her daughter, Emma, had grown distant and cold, moving to California and calling maybe twice a year, Max had been there. And when Max himself had finally succumbed to age, lying his head in her lap one last time as the vet administered the injection, Helen had felt the last thread of connection to warmth and love dissolve. She hadn't cried. Not really. She had simply stopped feeling much of anything. But now, staring at this trembling creature tied to a signpost like garbage, something old and dormant stirred. She put the bus in park, engaged the brake, and before she could talk herself out of it, she opened the door and stepped down onto the cold pavement. The air bit at her face. October in upstate New York had teeth, especially in the hour before true sunrise, when the darkness still clung to the edges of the world. She walked slowly toward the dog, her boots scuffing against the asphalt. He watched her approach with wide, terrified eyes, brown and deep, filled with a confusion that bordered on madness. He couldn't have been more than 30 pounds. Some kind of mixed breed with wiry fur, the color of rust and copper, caked with mud, and what might have been his own waste. Helen knelt down a few feet away, extending her hand slowly, palm down, the way she'd learned as a child. The dog pressed himself against the cold metal of the signpost, trying to make himself smaller, invisible. His body shook so violently she could hear his teeth chattering. Someone had done this. Someone had brought this living, breathing creature to this corner of the world, tied him to this post and driven away. The cruelty of it struck her like a physical blow. Not the dramatic cruelty of violence, but the cold, calculated cruelty of indifference. Whoever had done this had made a choice to erase a life that had become inconvenient. She looked around. The street was still empty. No cars, no witnesses, no one to ask what had happened or how long he'd been here. The houses nearby sat dark and silent, their inhabitants still lost in sleep or pointedly ignoring what they'd seen. In neighborhoods like this, people had learned to mind their business. Involvement meant complications, and complications meant trouble no one could afford. Helen reached forward slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. From the cold or from emotion, she wasn't sure. The dog flinched but didn't snap. She touched the extension cord wrapped around his neck, and her stomach turned. It had been pulled tight, tight enough to restrict, but not quite tight enough to kill, tight enough to ensure he wouldn't slip free. The fur beneath was matted with dried blood where the rubber had chafed the skin raw. Her fingers worked at the knot, but it had been secured with deliberate cruelty, pulled and twisted until the cord had become a solid mass of orange rubber. She tugged. The dog whimpered, and Helen felt a flash of anger so sharp and hot it startled her. She hadn't felt anger in years. Disappointment, yes, resignation, constantly. But anger. Anger required caring, and caring led to pain. She stood and walked quickly back to the bus, her mind racing. In the storage compartment beneath the seats, she kept an emergency kit. Flares, first aid supplies, a flashlight, and a small utility knife she'd bought years ago after getting a flat tire on a dark road. She grabbed the knife and returned to the dog, who watched her with those wide, uncomprehending eyes. Helen sawed carefully at the extension cord, trying not to pull or jostle his neck. The blade was sharp, and within 30 seconds the cord split and fell away. The dog remained frozen, not understanding yet that he was free. Helen reached for the collar beneath, a cheap nylon thing, faded and torn, and unbuckled it, tossing it aside. Red, raw skin ringed his neck like a terrible necklace. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The dog stared at her. She stared back. Then, slowly, as if testing the reality of his freedom, he took one shaky step forward. Then another. And then, with a movement that seemed to surprise even himself, he pressed his body against Helen's leg, a trembling mass of fur and bone and desperate need. Helen felt something break inside her, something she'd kept carefully sealed for 4 years. Her hand, moving almost of its own accord, came to rest on the dog's head. He was so small, so fragile. She could feel every ridge of his spine, every rib pressing against skin. He hadn't just been abandoned this morning. He'd been neglected for far longer. She looked at her watch. 6:50. She was now 11 minutes behind schedule. Corey would be waiting. The route would be thrown off. There would be calls to the depot, questions, maybe a formal complaint. She could lose her job for this, for stopping, for breaking protocol. The district didn't care about dogs tied to signposts. The district cared about schedules and liability and parents who threatened lawsuits when buses ran late. Helen looked down at the dog pressed against her leg, still shaking, still whimpering softly, and then she made a choice that would alter the trajectory of everything that came after. She lifted him carefully, expecting resistance or fear, but he simply went limp in her arms, a dead weight of surrender. She carried him to the bus, climbed the steps, and set him gently on the floor near the driver's seat. He immediately curled into the smallest possible ball, his nose tucked under his tail, his eyes watching her with wary hope. Helen settled back into the driver's seat, released the brake, and pulled back onto Bridgewater Street. Her heart was hammering in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had just broken every rule. She had deviated from the route. She had brought an unauthorized animal onto a school bus. She had prioritized a stranger's suffering over her professional duty. And as she glanced down at the trembling creature beside her, she realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She didn't regret it, not even a little. The rest of the route unfolded like a fever dream. Helen picked up Corey Jenkins at 6:53, 11 minutes late. His grandmother noticed immediately, her eyes sharp with suspicion, as the bus doors hissed open, but she said nothing. Corey climbed aboard, backpack bouncing, and froze when he saw the dog curled at the front of the bus. Helen watched the boy's face in the rear-view mirror, shock, confusion, then a spreading smile that reached his eyes. He started to move forward, but Helen raised a hand, gentle but firm. The boy understood. He slipped into his usual seat 3 rows back, craning his neck to steal glances at the unexpected passenger, whispering to himself with barely contained excitement. Stop after stop, the bus filled with children, and each one had the same reaction. Wide eyes, whispered questions. A few tried to approach, but Helen's presence, steady, calm, unmistakably serious, kept them at bay. She had never had discipline problems on her bus. The children sensed she wasn't someone to test, not out of fear, but out of respect. They knew her as fair, quiet, and utterly consistent. This morning, that consistency had cracked, and they could feel it. By the time she reached Riverside Elementary at 8:28, 13 minutes late, there were 64 children on board and a half-starved dog pressed against the base of the driver's seat, still trembling, but noticeably calmer. Helen could see Principal Vickers standing at the curb, arms crossed, his face a mask of administrative displeasure. She had radioed ahead, citing traffic delays, knowing full well that lie would last only until the first parent called to complain. The children filed off the bus in unusual silence, each one glancing back at the dog, some whispering promises to tell their parents, others simply staring with the kind of reverence children reserve for small miracles. When the last one disembarked, Helen sat alone with the dog, the empty bus suddenly cavernous and quiet. She looked down at him. He was watching her now, his eyes less wild, less desperate. There was something in that gaze that Helen recognized, though it took her a moment to name it. trust. The fragile, tentative beginnings of trust. Principal Vickers appeared at the bus door, his face flushed. He was a compact man in his early 40s, the kind who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit. Helen had never particularly liked him, though she'd never particularly disliked him either. He was a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats lived in worlds of rules and consequences. He climbed the first 2 steps, stopped when he saw the dog, and his expression shifted from anger to disbelief. Helen didn't wait for him to speak. She rose from her seat, carefully stepping over the dog, and descended the steps to meet Vickers at eye level. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the cold morning air swirling between them. Vickers spoke first, his voice tight with controlled frustration. He asked about the delay, about protocol, about the unauthorized animal, about the liability, about the complaints that would certainly come, about her job, which hung now in a precarious balance. Helen listened, her face expressionless. And when he finished, she simply told him the truth. She had found a dog tied to a signpost. She had freed him. She had brought him aboard, because leaving him there would have been, in her view, a moral failure she wasn't prepared to commit. She understood there would be consequences. She was prepared to accept them. Vickers stared at her, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment. Then he asked what she intended to do with the animal now. Helen hadn't thought that far ahead. The last few hours had been pure instinct, reaction without planning. She glanced back at the bus, where the dog remained curled in his small ball of fur and fear. She thought about her empty house, about the silence that greeted her every afternoon, about the years she'd spent moving through routines that meant nothing, feeling nothing, wanting nothing. She told Vickers she would take the dog home. She would find him proper care, and she would return tomorrow to drive her route, unless he intended to fire her on the spot. Vickers seemed to weigh something invisible. Then, with a sigh that carried the weight of compromise, he told her to go home. He would handle the paperwork. There would be a formal write-up, a notation in her file. But given her 17 years of perfect service, he would frame it as a one-time lapse in judgment, brought on by extraordinary circumstances. She was not to bring animals on the bus again. She was not to deviate from her route again. Was that understood? Helen nodded. It was understood. She returned to the bus, scooped up the dog, lighter than he should have been, all bone and matted fur, and carried him to her car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic with rust around the wheel wells and an odometer that had stopped counting somewhere past 200,000 miles. She settled the dog in the passenger seat, where he immediately curled up again, his eyes never leaving her face. The drive home took 20 minutes through streets she knew by heart. Millbrook in the daylight looked tired, like a town that had given up on prosperity but hadn't quite committed to decline. Storefronts with faded awnings, sidewalks cracked and uneven, houses with peeling paint and yards that needed tending. It wasn't ugly exactly, just worn, resigned. Helen's house sat at the end of Sycamore Lane, a small 2-bedroom ranch with vinyl siding the color of pale yellow and shutters that had once been green but had faded to gray. The lawn was mowed but unremarkable. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left. Everything about it said ordinary, forgettable, safe. She carried the dog inside, setting him down gently on the kitchen floor. He stood on unsteady legs, his nose working overtime, processing this new environment with cautious curiosity. The house smelled of stale coffee and the faint ghost of Max, though he'd been gone for 4 years. Helen had never gotten rid of his things. The bed in the corner, the food bowl still in the cabinet, the leash hanging by the back door. She filled one of Max's old bowls with water and set it down. The dog approached slowly, sniffed, then drank with desperate gulps that made Helen wince. She'd seen enough nature documentaries to know you weren't supposed to let a dehydrated animal drink too fast, but she didn't have the heart to stop him. When he'd emptied the bowl, he looked up at her, water dripping from his muzzle, and something in his expression made Helen's throat tighten. She refilled the bowl, set it down, and watched him drink again, slower this time. Then she opened the cabinet where she kept canned goods and found a can of tuna. She dumped it onto a plate and set it on the floor. The dog fell on it with the intensity of starvation, eating so fast he barely seemed to chew. Helen lowered herself into a kitchen chair and watched. The morning felt surreal, like she'd stepped out of her own life and into someone else's story. She'd broken rules. She'd risked her job. She'd brought a stranger into her home. All for a creature she'd known for less than 3 hours. And yet, sitting there in her quiet kitchen, watching this broken animal eat like it was his first meal in days, which it probably was, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt needed. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Need led to attachment. Attachment led to loss. Loss led to the kind of emptiness she'd been living with since David left, since Emma stopped calling, since Max had taken his last breath. She'd built a life around not needing or being needed, around simply existing in a routine that demanded nothing but consistency. But the dog finished eating and looked up at her with those brown eyes, and Helen felt the walls she'd built begin to crack. She spent the rest of the morning caring for him. She filled a plastic tub with warm water and used dish soap to bathe him, working carefully around the raw skin on his neck. The water turned brown with dirt, and worse. He didn't fight her, just stood shivering in the tub, accepting her ministrations with weary surrender. When she lifted him out and wrapped him in an old towel, he was noticeably smaller, his frame pitifully thin beneath the wet fur. She dried him as best she could, then carried him to Max's old bed in the corner of the living room. He circled it twice, sniffed it thoroughly, then collapsed into it with a sigh so deep and human-like that Helen almost laughed. Within seconds, he was asleep, his body finally releasing the tension of fear and exhaustion. Helen sat on the couch and watched him sleep. She should call a vet. She should check for a microchip. She should post on local lost and found boards. She should do all the responsible things one did when finding a stray animal. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat in her living room, in the mid-morning light filtering through cheap curtains, and watched a nameless dog sleep in her dead dog's bed. And for the first time in 4 years, the silence of her house didn't feel quite so oppressive. Outside, the world continued its relentless turning. But inside, on Sycamore Lane, something small and fragile had begun to shift. The dog slept for 14 hours straight. Helen checked on him every 30 minutes at first, concerned by the absolute stillness of his small body, pressing her fingers gently against his ribs to feel the reassuring rise and fall of breath. Eventually, she relaxed, understanding that this wasn't the sleep of illness, but of profound exhaustion, the kind that came from surviving something terrible. She used the time to prepare. She drove to the pet supply store on Route 9, a big box retailer she hadn't entered since Max died. The automatic doors whooshed open, and she was immediately assaulted by the overwhelming normalcy of it all. The bright lights, the orderly aisles, the cheerful employees in green aprons asking if she needed help finding anything. She mumbled something non-committal and grabbed a cart. Dog food, the good kind, not the cheapest. A new collar, soft nylon in blue, a proper leash. A bag of treats, shampoo formulated for sensitive skin, antibiotic ointment for the wounds on his neck. A new bed, though she suspected he'd claim Max's old one. Toys, a rope, a squeaky ball, a stuffed duck that looked ridiculous but somehow necessary. At the register, the teenage cashier smiled and asked if she was getting a new puppy. Helen paused, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't thought of him as hers. He was just a dog she'd found, a temporary situation, something she was managing until she figured out what to do next. But as the cashier scanned the items, Helen heard herself say, yes, yes, she was. The lie, if it was a lie, settled over her like a coat she'd forgotten she owned. She returned home to find him still sleeping, and she unpacked her purchases with the quiet efficiency of someone following muscle memory. She'd done this before, years ago when Max was still a puppy and the house felt alive with possibility, back when David still came home at night, when Emma still called her mom without the edge of irritation, when life felt like something more than a series of days to be endured. That evening the dog finally woke. He lifted his head slowly, disoriented, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar room until they found Helen sitting on the couch. She watched, understanding dawn, the recognition that he was safe, warm, no longer tied to a signpost in the cold. His tail, a thin whip of a thing, thumped once against the bed, just once, but it was enough. Helen fed him again, carefully, small portions to avoid upsetting a stomach that had been empty too long. He ate with less desperation this time, actually chewing, actually tasting. Afterward, she clipped the new collar around his neck, loose enough to be comfortable, but secure. The blue looked good against his copper fur, which was already beginning to fluff as it dried. She should name him, but naming him felt too permanent, too much like claiming. So she simply called him what he was. Dog. Hey, dog. Come here, dog. It was functional, impersonal, safe. The next morning, Helen woke at 5:30, same as always. The dog slept on the floor beside her bed, having migrated there sometime in the night. She'd woken once around 2 a.m. to find him staring at her in the darkness, his eyes reflecting the faint light from the hallway. She'd reached down to touch his head, and he'd settled back to sleep, reassured by the contact. She returned to work. Bus 47, Route 17, 64 children, 8:15 arrival. The routine welcomed her back like an old friend, familiar and undemanding. But something had changed. The children asked about the dog. Parents had heard stories from their kids and approached her with questions, some curious, some suspicious. Principal Vickers watched her with wary assessment, as if expecting another breakdown in protocol. But Helen drove her route with renewed focus, perhaps even a strange kind of joy. She had something to come home to now, someone waiting. The dog adapted with surprising ease. He followed her from room to room, never more than a few feet away, as if terrified that distance meant abandonment. When she sat, he sat beside her. When she cooked, he lay at her feet. When she showered, he waited outside the bathroom door. His presence was constant, quiet, and utterly devoted. Helen tried to find his owner. She posted on community boards, called the local shelter, checked for missing dog reports. Nothing. It was as if he'd materialized out of nowhere, conjured by her own loneliness. She knew she should be more persistent, should take him to a vet to scan for a microchip, but she kept finding reasons to delay. Just one more day. Just to make sure he was healthy first. Just to give him time to recover. The truth, which she didn't want to examine too closely, was that she didn't want to find his owner. She wanted him to be hers. 3 weeks passed. The dog gained weight. His ribs no longer visible beneath his fur. The wounds on his neck healed, leaving only faint scars hidden beneath his collar. His eyes lost that wild, haunted quality, replaced by something softer, more trusting. He began to play, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. The squeaky duck became his favorite, and he carried it everywhere, the absurd toy clamped gently in his jaws. Helen found herself talking to him, not baby talk or the performative chatter some people used with pets, but real conversation. She told him about her day, about the children on her route, about the weather, about the loneliness that had defined her life for so long. The dog listened, with those attentive brown eyes, his head tilted slightly, and Helen could almost believe he understood. On a Wednesday evening in early November, Emma called. The phone rang during dinner, canned soup for Helen, kibble for the dog, and Helen stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Emma's voice came through tinny and distant, more obligation than affection. She asked the perfunctory questions. "How are you? How's work? How's the house?" Helen answered in kind, her responses equally hollow. "Fine. Same as always. Nothing new." But then, before she could stop herself, Helen mentioned the dog. There was a pause, pregnant with surprise. Emma asked questions, actual questions with genuine curiosity beneath them. "How did you find him? What's his name? Are you keeping him?" And Helen found herself telling the story. The signpost, the extension cord, the whimpering, the choice to stop. Emma was quiet for a moment after Helen finished. Then she said something that nearly undid Helen completely. She said it sounded like Mom had saved him, and maybe, in a way, he'd saved her too. Helen couldn't speak around the sudden tightness in her throat. They said goodbye shortly after, but the conversation felt different somehow. Less performative, more real. That night, Helen sat on the couch with the dog curled beside her, his head resting on her thigh. She stroked his fur absently, her mind wandering through memories she usually kept locked away. David leaving, Emma growing distant, Max dying. The slow erosion of purpose and meaning until all that remained was routine. She'd spent 4 years convinced she'd lost everything that mattered, that the capacity for connection had been hollowed out of her, leaving only the empty shell of someone going through motions. But this small creature, abandoned and broken, had somehow slipped past her defenses, had reminded her that caring wasn't weakness, that opening yourself to another living thing, even knowing the inevitable pain of loss, was what made life worth living. The dog shifted, pressing closer against her leg, and Helen felt a tear slide down her cheek. Just one, then another, and then, for the first time since Max died, she allowed herself to cry. Not the dramatic sobbing of grief, but the quiet tears of someone finally, letting go of the weight they'd been carrying alone. The dog didn't move. He simply stayed pressed against her, warm and solid and utterly present. And Helen understood something profound in that moment. He wasn't Max. He would never be Max, but he didn't need to be. He was himself, scarred, damaged, resilient, just like her. She thought about the person who had tied him to that signpost, who had made the choice to discard a life because it had become inconvenient or burdensome. She wondered if they ever thought about him, if they felt guilt or relief or nothing at all. She would never know. But sitting there with this dog who had chosen to trust her despite every reason not to, Helen felt a fierce, protective love that startled her with its intensity. She had broken the rules to save him, but in doing so, she'd also begun to save herself. Winter came early to Millbrook that year. By mid-November, snow had already blanketed the town 3 times, each storm leaving behind a crystalline world that looked cleaner, softer, more forgiving than the grey reality beneath. Helen drove her route through streets transformed, the yellow bus cutting paths through white like a bright promise against the monochrome landscape. The dog, she'd finally started calling him Scout, a name that emerged one morning without planning, feeling right in a way that surprised her, now greeted each day with eagerness. He'd learned the rhythm of her schedule. He knew the sound of her alarm, the routine of breakfast, the moment when she'd put on her jacket and grab her keys. And he knew, with the certainty that only animals possess, that she would always come back. On the mornings when she left for work, Scout would settle into his bed by the window, watching her car disappear down Sycamore Lane. And every afternoon when she returned, he'd be in that same spot, tail already wagging before she even opened the door. The consistency of his devotion moved her in ways she couldn't articulate. Helen had taken him to the vet, finally, 6 weeks after finding him. Dr. Patricia Chen, a woman in her 30s with gentle hands and an efficient manner, had examined Scout thoroughly. No microchip, no identification, Approximately 3 years old, mixed breed, probably some terrier, some spaniel, some things that would remain forever mysterious. Healthy now, though he bore the marks of long-term neglect, malnutrition, dental issues from poor diet, scars that suggested a life lived rough. Dr. Chen had looked at Helen with understanding eyes when delivering the assessment. She'd seen enough cases like this to know the story without being told. Some people treated animals as disposable, as conveniences that lost value when they became inconvenient. She'd asked Helen if she intended to keep him, and Helen had answered without hesitation this time. Yes, she was keeping him. The formal adoption had felt like a small ceremony. Paperwork signed, vaccinations updated, a rabies tag added to Scout's collar. Dr. Chen had smiled and told Helen she was doing a good thing. That Scout was lucky to have found her. But driving home that day, Scout sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window despite the cold, Helen had understood that luck ran both ways. The children on her bus route had collectively adopted Scout as their unofficial mascot. They asked about him every day, brought him treats, which Helen had to politely refuse, explaining dietary restrictions. Drew pictures of him that Helen taped to her refrigerator. He'd become a kind of legend, the dog the bus driver saved. The symbol of something good in a world that often felt short on goodness. Even Principal Vickers had softened. He'd approached Helen one afternoon in early December, his usual administrative stiffness tempered by something almost human. He'd heard about the dog, heard she'd kept him. He wanted her to know that while he couldn't officially condone what she'd done that morning, he understood why she'd done it. Sometimes, he'd said, the right thing and the rule-following thing weren't the same. Sometimes you had to choose. Helen had thanked him, surprised by the admission. It was the closest thing to an apology the bureaucratic mind could offer, and she accepted it in the spirit intended. Christmas approached. Helen hadn't celebrated in years, not really. She'd go through the motions, a small tree, a few decorations, a quiet dinner alone, while Emma sent a text from California wishing her happy holidays. But this year felt different. This year, she had company. She bought Scout presents, a new bed, gourmet treats, a ridiculous reindeer costume she knew he'd tolerate with patient dignity. She strung lights on her house for the first time in 5 years, standing on a ladder in the cold while Scout supervised from the yard, barking encouragement. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Patterson from next door came over to comment on how lovely it looked, how nice to see Helen in the holiday spirit again. Helen realized she'd become, without noticing, part of the community again. Not just the bus driver who kept to herself, but a person with a story, with a life that intersected with others in small but meaningful ways. Emma called on Christmas Eve. The conversation was longer this time, easier. They talked about Scout, about Emma's job, about the possibility of her visiting in the spring. There were no promises, but there was warmth, connection, the fragile rebuilding of something that had seemed permanently broken. After they hung up, Helen sat by the small tree, Scout curled at her feet, and felt something she'd almost forgotten. Contentment. Not the manic happiness of new love or the desperate relief of crisis averted. Just the quiet, steady contentment of knowing you're exactly where you need to be. The new year arrived with a blizzard that shut down the town for 2 days. Helen and Scout were snowed in, the house a warm cocoon against the howling white world outside. They played tug-of-war with the rope toy. They watched old movies. They simply existed together in comfortable silence. On one of those snow-trapped afternoons, Helen found herself thinking about the moment she'd first heard Scout's whimper from inside the bus. How easily she could have kept driving. How the entire trajectory of the last 3 months hinged on that single choice to stop, to care, to act, despite the rules and the risks and the potential consequences. She thought about all the other people who must have passed Scout that morning. The cars that didn't slow, the neighbors who didn't look out their windows, the person who'd tied him there in the first place, driving away without a backward glance. How many moments of potential compassion had been passed over before hers, and she thought about her own life before Scout, the years of emotional hibernation, the routines that meant nothing, the slow fade into irrelevance and invisibility. She'd been tied to her own signpost, in a way, bound by grief and disappointment and the terrible belief that caring led only to pain. Scout had freed her as surely as she'd freed him. By February, Scout had been part of Helen's life for 4 months. He was a different dog now, healthy, confident, joyful. His coat gleamed, his eyes were bright. He greeted each day with enthusiasm and each person with cautious but genuine warmth. The scars remained, both physical and emotional. He still startled at sudden movements. He still watched Helen with that edge of worry when she left, as if afraid each departure might be permanent. But he was healing. They both were. Helen had started going to a weekly book club at the library. She'd joined a community garden committee, small steps back into the world of the living. Scout came with her when possible, charming the other members with his gentle presence. He had a gift for making people smile, for drawing out kindness from strangers. One evening in early March, Helen and Scout walked the route she drove every morning, now on foot in the softening dusk. They reached the corner of Bridgewater Street, the intersection with the signpost. It stood there, unremarkable, its metal surface bearing no evidence of the suffering it had once witnessed. Helen stopped, and Scout sat beside her, patient and attentive. She looked at this ordinary corner of an ordinary town and tried to imagine what would have happened if she'd driven past that morning. Scout would have died there, probably, slow and cold and alone. Just another invisible tragedy in a world full of them. But she hadn't driven past. She'd stopped. And that choice had created ripples she was still discovering. It had reconnected her with her daughter. It had reintegrated her into her community. It had reminded her that her life still had value and purpose, that she was capable of love and being loved. All because she'd listened to a whimper. They walked home as the streetlights flickered on, casting pools of amber light across the sidewalk. Scout trotted beside her, occasionally looking up to check that she was still there, still present, still his. And Helen looked back at him, this small creature who'd been thrown away and had somehow become her salvation. She thought about the people watching her story unfold on Beyond the Instinct, about how many of them had their own signposts, their own moments of choice, about how easy it was to keep driving, to look away, to choose comfort over compassion, and about how much beauty and meaning and connection we missed when we made that choice. The spring brought Emma home for a visit. She stayed for a week, the longest they'd spent together in 5 years. Scout won her over immediately, his gentle persistence melting the careful distance she usually maintained. Helen watched her daughter laugh at Scout's antics, cuddle him on the couch, take him for walks around the neighborhood. She saw Emma begin to relax, to soften, to remember that home could be more than a place you escaped from. On Emma's last evening, they sat on the back porch as the sun set. Scout sprawled between them, his head on Emma's lap. Emma was quiet for a long time, then spoke without looking at her mother. She said she'd been angry for so long. At Dad for leaving, at Mom for becoming a ghost, at herself for not knowing how to fix any of it, but seeing Helen now, seeing her alive again, seeing what saving Scout had done, it had given her hope. Hope that people could change, that broken things could heal, that it was never too late to choose differently. Helen reached over and took her daughter's hand, and they sat like that until the stars emerged, connected by touch and silence, and the small dog who'd somehow brought them back together. Scout lived to be 13, 10 years with Helen in the house on Sycamore Lane, 10 years of morning routines and afternoon walks and quiet evenings on the couch. 10 years of unconditional love from a creature who'd been discarded but had chosen to trust again anyway. When the time came, when age and illness finally caught up despite the best care and deepest love, Helen held Scout in her arms at Dr. Chen's office. She told him he was good, that he was loved, that he'd saved her life in ways he'd never understand, and as he took his last breath, his brown eyes fixed on her face, she knew he'd died secure in the knowledge that he was cherished. The grief was profound, but it was different from the emptiness that had followed Max's death. This grief was full of gratitude, full of memory, full of the absolute certainty that loving Scout and being loved by him had made her life immeasurably richer. Helen scattered his ashes at the corner of Bridgewater Street, beneath the signpost where his life had almost ended but had instead been transformed. She planted wildflowers there, and they bloomed every spring, purple and yellow and white, a small burst of beauty in an ordinary place. Helen retired from driving buses at 65. She volunteered at the animal shelter 3 days a week, fostering dogs that needed temporary homes, giving them the same chance Scout had given her. She never kept them permanently. Her heart still belonged to the small copper dog who'd trusted her first. But she gave each one the gift Scout had given her, the knowledge that they were seen, that they mattered, that someone cared enough to stop, to break the rules, to choose compassion over convenience. Emma visited more often. She had children of her own now, and they grew up hearing the story of Scout, the dog Grandma saved, the dog who saved Grandma back. It became family mythology, a reminder that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways you'd never predict. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when Helen drove past Bridgewater Street, she'd slow down slightly, her eyes finding the wildflowers beneath the signpost. She'd remember a cold October dawn, a trembling whimper, a choice that changed everything. She'd remember that she'd been lost too once, tied to her own signpost by grief and loneliness and the terrible fear of caring. And she'd remember how a small, broken creature had shown her the way back to life, not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through presence, through trust, through the simple, profound act of staying. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Beyond the Instinct for more true stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Because sometimes, the life you save might just be your own.